The first California County Pension Reform Conference was held Saturday, May 10th, 2014 in San Rafael. This is the third topic of the day listed forth on the agenda. Certain aspects of the history, current situation, and future of pension reform in California.
Dan Palisser is president of California Pension Reform. He was the chief of staff of Keith Richmond, an assemblyman from Southern California, who has the reputation of having been the first Sacramento politician to say, we have a problem. And so I'd like to have Dan just tell you a little bit about that part of history.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody who's put this event together, and also everybody who's come to hear what's going on. Because I know, Keith Richmond, who I'd say kind of is the patron saint of pension reformers, because he really understood where we were going. He was kind of burdened with being farsighted and having a sense of obligation as a member of the legislature to attack what he thought was the biggest problem facing the state. But in the early conversations about this, and when you have such a good handle on the numbers, you wonder, why isn't everybody else excited about this? Why am I like the only guy who's talking about it? Keith was, he felt that his other legislators should have cared about this. He thought that the newspapers should have cared about this. He thought the taxpayers group should have cared about this. And at the time when we started, it was just, there was like virtually no awareness. And it started in 2003, and if you indulge me just a minute, the way we found out about it was neither Keith or I, or Joe Cansamillo, who was with us at the same time, started off as people who wanted to fix pensions. We didn't know there was a problem. We were trying to fix the state budget. And when we sat down with a legislative analyst, she came out with this wonderful chart, and I looked through all of my office materials, those boxes that you stick in your garage and when you leave a job, and I tried to find this chart. But Liz Hill came up with a chart that just said, let's look at the major, like the 5 biggest components of the budget, and then the 5 things that are growing the fastest, and put all those lines on a chart and see what they look like. And what the chart showed was you had a whole bunch of little things that were kind of clustered around the average growth of your budgets over the last decade. And then what you saw then was there was one line that just shot up that was like 3 or 4 times as high and as steep as every other line on the graph, and that was your pension costs. And as a numbers person, you just look at that and go, well, I can't address the major problem without getting a handle on this line. And at the time, we didn't know what that meant. And over the course of months, we were able to kind of dig into it and figure out, well, why is it going up, and what can you do to change it, and what are the legal and financial constructs. You started to do the analysis, but it became clear back in 2003 that we would one day be here with local governments facing the prospects of bankruptcy because they could no longer handle their pension obligations. And it was predictable. It was just simple, well, moderately complex math that gets you to the point that you've got what is, Keith described it as a cancer that's growing in your budget. And one time he said, it's like if the local governments would take an x-ray of their lung cancer every year and look at it and say, well, yeah, it's there and it's getting a little bit bigger, but never actually going for the chemotherapy. It's like you're just saying, I don't want to do it. I'm going to try to hope it goes away on its own. But as a physician, Keith just knew you had to buckle down and do something about it. So pensions, the problem with pensions in California started actually back in 1980, in the early 80s, when we changed from a system where pensions were funded by bonds, which all had predictable rates of return, and that it was relatively stable, and the interest rates from the bonds were, relatively low compared to what you could get from equities. So people didn't, you weren't offered great pensions because they knew at the time they couldn't afford them, right? You had some balance. You matched the risk of the bonds with the pension liability that you were incurring. Eventually, CalPERS went to the people and got the right to purchase equities, and the rest of the pension funds in the state could buy equities, which made their finances more volatile. That was the beginning of our problems, because then the actuaries started to have the ability to show that you had more money, that you could improve your benefits without cost. And it was easier to manipulate the numbers when you were dealing with volatile equity returns than you were with just the standard, simple bond interest. And then as a result, when the chart showed earlier, in the 90s, we had this incredible run-up in the stock market, and all of a sudden, it looked like we had free money. You know, that the masters of the universe who were managing our public funds had somehow done such a great job, they could give away money. And we all know how that turned out. It was like a year later, after they gave away all the public funds that they had somehow amassed to the retirees, that we really started to see the pressure, because they made, at the end of the day, we are making promises to people that we can't afford to keep. And so, you know, as John said earlier, we could talk about these things for hours, but the one thing I'd like to say is that, to leave with folks, is fundamentally we have to rebalance the promises we make with the money we want to back them up with. There's nothing wrong with people who accept the benefits that their employers give them. What we have to do is we have to make sure that we're not promising people benefits that we can't afford, and that we have to close our fire stations and take cops off the beat and reduce our social services in order to fulfill this promise that we've made to employees. So this is all about changing, when it really comes down to it, you put all the numbers aside, it's about changing the promises that we make to people, and that they're sustainable in the long run. We're out of whack. All the numbers that we see prove that. But this was something, again, that, you know, Keith saw 10 years ago, that we were going to be here. What he didn't see was that we were going to have a big enough group of people here who actually paid money to come today and listen to what we need to do to solve the problem. Because at the time it was a very small group, and I think the best way to introduce Jack is to say that Jack was one of the people who showed up. He was concerned about pensions, and he was doing his great work with Pension Tsunami, and we just saw Jack as a resource. He kind of raised his head. It's like, wait a minute, someone's collecting pension stories and trying to feed the media to raise awareness of this issue, that we were a little late to the party, but Jack was there first as a result of his work in his own community. So I think with that, we'll go to Jack.
I want to add one thing. I asked Jack this morning, Jack, how many stories have you read about pensions? And he said, oh, about 34,000.
I have to confess I haven't read them all thoroughly, okay? A lot of skimming going on there. Yeah, I'll give you just a little bit of background. When John talks about characters, of course, he didn't include himself in that, I'm sure. But I'm sure I'm one of the characters, because this is a rather strange thing that I got involved in. And just to kind of go back to 2004 is when I first noticed that there was a problem. And I observed in the newspaper that the Orange County general employees were asking for a pension increase, a formula increase. And I discovered that they'd already increased the public safety from 2% to 3%, which seemed like a lot to me. But the general employees wanted, I think it's probably the biggest enchilada that I'd ever seen, they wanted to go from 1.67 to 2.5%, which is a 62% increase in the pension formula. That's when I realized there was a problem, and that's why, of course, Orange County today has a $5.7 billion unfunded liability. Right about the same time, I read an article by a fellow named Ken Mandler up in Northern California, Sacramento area, who has become a friend. But he was running a course to help people get jobs with the state government. And the way he attracted them was by doing a column, which really wasn't a traditional column, because he kept running, and it was an advertisement, really. But it was titled, "Land a State Job and Become an Instant Millionaire." And I remembered reading that and saying, oh, what is this about? And indeed, in fact, I'm probably going to be running it again shortly. Periodically, usually once a year, I link to it because it is so amazing. And he does indeed show you what you would have to save, how much you would have to save in order to get $1 million annuity when you retired. So then I was sold. I was hooked. I had to get involved in this. And I started doing basically an email list each day. I was just sending out articles. I didn't have a website, and 6 months later I set up the website. Around that time also, another interesting thing happened, which basically John already mentioned, which is that we ended up, our Fullerton taxpayer group was asked to participate by Pacific Legal Foundation in protecting the taxpayers from an attempt to issue $1 billion in pension obligation bonds. And this was the Schwarzenegger administration, and they were basically doing it. They wanted to do it in order to pay the obligation for that current year, to help pay it. And that didn't look like a good idea to us. So we said, yes, we will be the plaintiffs, and we went to battle with them. And as John said, the court ended up, they did appeal it up one level, and the court basically said, no, you can't do that. It's unconstitutional. So I think we probably have saved a lot of money, because I suspect that that route would have been used since then had we not managed to cut it off. Now, right about this time was when I got a call from a guy named Dan Pellissier. I was doing this pension tsunami thing, and he put Keith Richmond on the phone, and we talked a bit, and he thanked me. I was impressed. I'd never had somebody, especially from another district, call me for anything as an elected legislator. And it was shortly after that that Keith Richmond put together the California Foundation for Fiscal Responsibility, which is way too long a name, but it was a small but hearty band. And I remember John coming to one of those meetings in Sacramento, and he looked around the room, and there were, what, 6 of us maybe at that meeting, 7. And John told us he was passionate, and he was, gung-ho, and he really wanted us to do something. And I said, look, there's only 6 of us. We can't do much right now. But ultimately, I knew we would get there. The thing that CFFR did that I think probably had the most impact of anything in this battle in 2009 was, and Marcia Fritz was the one who spearheaded this and managed to get the list from CalPERS of the $100,000 club, $100,000 pension club. And once that went online, we began to see real interest on the part of media who, for the most part, had never realized before what public employees were getting paid. So when they saw these pensions, of course, they immediately went from the pensions to the pay and began looking at city budgets more carefully as well. And I think that that probably more than anything brought them over to our side. Prior to that, I think they pretty much considered themselves to be allies of the public employees, basically all working people, and when they discovered that there were that many people who were retiring with $100,000 or more, they were really shocked. And I think that this probably more than anything has helped to dispel what the unions would call the right-wing conspiracy to steal pensions. Because if there is a conspiracy, then every newspaper in the state of California is involved in it, and I don't think that's quite what's happening here. Pension Tsunami was designed mainly to focus on the media and let them know what was going on in the rest of the state and even across the country, because most newspaper people were feeling pretty isolated. They thought this was something unusual in their community, and once they began seeing everything aggregated on a daily basis, I think it became more clear to them what was happening. So it's been fun, and I think we've created a real public awareness over the years with everybody working in their own area, and now we've gotten to the point where we have a group like this, which is quite impressive, I think. So anyway, I think I'll stop.
I'd like to next introduce Carol Denniston, and I'll just say that I read Jack's email blast every day, and I usually wind up reading 2 or 3 or 4 articles, and I've done that for years. And what my experience is Carol is the most quoted California attorney in municipal finance, restructuring, and bankruptcy, in my experience.
Well, somebody has to stir the pot. And in terms of being characters, I've been identified as the Mary Poppins of the pension world, or the plumber. And so I want to talk to you today. And first of all, I want to say a big thank you to everybody in this room, because this has been a long road to get to the point where people can talk about a complex issue, where the facts have been brought out. I think you've got a lot of leadership here that's helping to identify the problem. But the next step, and that's where Mary Poppins and the plumber become involved, is what do you do with that information? Because now that we have an awareness of the problem, we got to figure out what kind of tools do we need in the toolkit to fix the problem, because the benefit of all the work that's been done to gather the information and put municipalities on some kind of fiscally sustainable path, where your service providers and your police and fire are still providing police and fire. That's the challenge that I took on early in 2009. And in 2009, I said to a group of people when we were talking about this, I was not aware of the pension problem. I was like, why are they turning off the street lights? Why are they rolling up the roads? Why are the parks closed? What's going on with swimming pools? And when we began to ask those questions, the answer was, well, we can't afford those because we're paying our pension obligations. That was the pressure, that was the financial pressure that was beginning to cause service insolvency, and it was happening all over the country. And being a mediator since 1990, I said, well, what we need to do is just get everybody in a room together and talk about it. And everybody laughed. They're like, the unions won't talk, this group won't talk, that group won't talk. And in 2009, that was kind of a naive view. Fast forward to 2014, and look at what we've had to learn in the marketplace. We had Vallejo file, without impairing pensions, return to a very challenging situation where balancing the budget's quite difficult. We have an unfolding story in Stockton where the pensions aren't being impaired, and Judge Klein starts the confirmation hearing on Monday with comments at the last status conference was, folks, I don't know whether I can confirm this plan because I'm not so sure it's going to work since you haven't dealt with your largest liability. And you have the capital market creditor, Franklin Templeton, standing up and saying, listen to us, Judge, we're getting screwed in the plan, which is true, but it's not fair or equitable without taking a look and restructuring pension obligations. But you have San Bernardino, which is chaos in a pot. They didn't have enough money to file bankruptcy in the first place. They went in a spin cycle and have stayed in the spin cycle despite the efforts of a very talented judge. Judge Jury recently sent them to mediation. That would have been around November in front of a retired bankruptcy judge. And at last status conference, she said, look, folks, you've been at it for a while with the mediation, so I'm going to give you a deadline at the next status conference to file your plan. And they don't have a plan, truth be told, if you read the pleadings. And that's going to be our big lesson in what not to do. So where do we go from here? Let's take a look at what happened in Detroit in terms of what tools are now going to be available. The first and most important thing about what's going on in the Detroit bankruptcy is that Judge Rhodes says, okay, we're a big mess here, and I'm going to appoint a whole bunch of mediators and send everybody off to talk to each other. And we had mediators in Stockton and mediator in San Bernardino. Those of you that may remember Mammoth Lakes, we had a mediator there. Progress was made when somebody introduced adult supervision and said basically mediators are retired judges, and they said, look, folks, if you want to negotiate it for yourself, you're probably going to get a better result than if you turn up in court and fight about it. And how much money do you want to put into the process? And as we've gone through each of these cases, the unions have learned that it's not always such a great thing for them to be in bankruptcy. Vallejo cost them $500 a month on an individual union member basis, and every issue they raised, they lost. Vallejo gave precedent, which the cities now use as leverage, which says we can rewrite your union contract in bankruptcy. But Vallejo didn't touch pensions. But Detroit has and is going to touch pensions, and here's what happened. With the use of 5 mediators and some very creative conversations, we do have a Mary Poppins moment because the mediators went out and actually got money from the private sector to save the art collection, and they designated those funds to go to reduce pension obligations. But that was contingent on the state stepping in and providing some contribution and some contingencies on some of the capital market creditors. The unions being terrified at the front end of the case where Bruce Bennett and the emergency manager, Kevin Orr, said you're only going to get 20% of your benefits, and provided actually a plan that showed just that. Everybody was going to get 20%. And when you're a retiree in Detroit and your benefits worth $30,000 or $40,000 a year, 20% of that is not enough to sustain a living. And That got everybody's attention, which then prompted the next segment where the judges said, well, let's go out and see what we can do, because the art collection had been in play. And the reason that's an important learning point is one of the conversations when I work with cities is, what other things do you have? Because the first thought is we have to cut costs. And so you immediately get into that cost cutting, but what other things can you do? And in California, it's a tough call unless you've got assets, because raising taxes is difficult. Raising sales tax will only get you to 9%, and that's not always, the voters are not always going to be happy about that. John's got a story from Mendocino about stopping a sales tax increase. But looking at options in terms of, are there other things that we can do? And at a recent conference, we heard about Harrisonburg, Pennsylvania, which had had a receiver tried to get into bankruptcy, got booted out of bankruptcy, spent God only knows how much money, the taxpayers trying to figure out how to resolve their problems. But when the receiver was appointed, they came up with a concept of leasing their water and sewer to the county, got the capital markets creditors involved, who said, we'll do a bond issuance on that. And bingo, enough money came in to reduce the unfunded pension liability, put the city back together, and their story's still unfolding. So Detroit, Harrisburg, Lexington, Kentucky is another example where the mayor said, look, folks, this isn't going to work. We're going to be broke. Hired an independent actuary, somehow had enough political power to get everybody in a room and hired a mediator, and they exited with a deal where there were reductions in pensions. Detroit's mediators have spent a long time, and as of the end of last week, all of the collective bargaining units have agreed to reductions in pensions that vary in range but are not greater than a 20% reduction, which means they're going to get approximately 80% of their pension as opposed to just the reverse. And that's a long-winded way of saying that, you know, at the end of the day, you have to remember that you're going to need to get everybody involved in this conversation. That's why the taxpayers are so critical. That's why bringing the attention to the service insolvency and trying to prevent that getting to a level where it's unsustainable and you look like San Bernardino, that's where doing the planning before you're broke is really important, because you don't have anything to work with afterwards. And it's where looking for creative solutions is going to be part of everybody's job description. But this, if I could say one thing in closing in terms of, you know, being a mechanic has to worry about all the parts in the car. It's not like just the steering wheel and the tires. To use an analogy that says your service, you know, your fire and police are your tires, the steering wheel is the city council, and the taxpayers are all locked inside the car with no way to exit. The key here is to recognize there's a party that has not been actively engaged, and that's because it's not in anybody's normal experience. But those of you that have outstanding bond issuances need to think about inviting the capital markets folks to the table. They are trying to figure out how to have a coherent dialogue. They too have had to learn some hard lessons in the bankruptcy cases that have existed, but they are also part of the solution. So when you think about setting your table and figuring out what your next steps are, be sure you've got it fully set and be willing to be creative, because I think we're going to see a lot more creative solutions come out of the conversations that are going on across the country. And the last thing I would say is do your planning and do everything you can to avoid ending up in a bankruptcy case. Stockton spent north of $20 million. Detroit's bill is close to 40, although the court's likely to cut that $40 million because they agreed to take the case for $20 million. Thankfully, I'm not that law firm. And then Vallejo, just to put it in perspective, costs $13 million. So the size of the city doesn't necessarily reduce the size of the cost. It's an expensive process. There's still a lot of uncertainties. And it's a lot better to figure out how to get everybody in a room together with some neutrally verified information and have a business conversation.
Committee having us here today. I want to reframe it just a little bit. I think we've danced around the issue a little bit, but this really is a intergenerational war, if you think about it, on your children and grandchildren. Whatever debt that you incur now, somebody's going to have to pay for, and at some point in time, that crowds out whatever abilities and services they'll have with their government years down the road. It does have impacts now, yes, but as I look at my kids, I have 4 kids, and I look at my pension system, I affectionately refer to my children as my 401ks, because in effect, if it doesn't last for me or for you, I need something to fall back on. In California, like a lot of other places, we've had a lot of problems. In 2005, Reason wrote about this. We entitled our report, The Gathering Pension Storm, not so different than what Jack was using in the pension tsunami. This really is a storm that's sweeping across the nation. We have a project that's going into different jurisdictions, municipalities, states throughout the entire nation to sit back and say, why are we allowing the government to use your pension dollars as a bargaining chip for everything else? Really, government should not be, as in our opinion, should not be a major portion of what happens in your retirement systems. Whether they contribute in, it's a different story. We can have that conversation too. But at some point in time, using those as bargaining chips is not the right way to go. The other thing too, all of you are in this room because you care about California. My children are 7th generation Californians. I'm an adopted child to California from Denver, but my wife is a 6th generation girl too. We have a vested right in this place. We want to make sure it works. So what we're doing with these projects is we're using some of our intellectual capital, research abilities that we've done for many years, but Reason's known for implementing projects, not just writing and talking about it, but coming in and helping public policymakers, decision makers, and politicians make the sort of decisions they need to. And Ventura is one of those places where they've decided enough is enough. And Ventura, for many other reasons that we could talk about for a long time, has been the poster child for a lot of pension problems. And so in Ventura County, we're not the ones that put forward it, but we've been instrumental in helping out with the whole process. The citizens there realized that there was a problem. And from the ground up, a very grassroots movement came, and they were able to put together an initiative that basically pulls the government out of the system, moves everybody to a defined contribution system going forward, and caps a lot of the other pay issues that go into it. A lot of people would push back and say, well, we've already done reform. Why do we need to do this? Well, I would posit a few things. One, we had some state reform a couple years ago called PEPRA, if you're familiar with that, which was supposed to make some major reforms. In the end, the governor only got a couple pieces of his desired package. But I worked for the legislature for almost 10 years, and working in the belly of the beast, as it were, I know that every promise there has an expiration date. If they want to change their mind, they can. And it only takes a majority plus one for them to change it. When you put it to the people, they have the final say, and if they want to change their mind in the future, they can. That's what we're trying to look forward, is how do we get the people more engaged and responsive? Again, a lot of this is, it's my eyes glaze over territory. But we want to make sure that your rational ignorance and the rational ignorance of your friends and neighbors who are busy with their children, soccer games, school, cooking dinner, whatever, does not get sucked up by the fact that they pay taxes, deserve certain services and expectations for their community, that they get a little bit more involved. And so we're hoping to push that effort forward, not just in Ventura, but across California, and make sure it's an effort across the country. My card's on the back table if you're interested in contacting me in the future.
Well, folks, anybody got any questions? Okay. Here, why don't you, in here? See if I can follow up with that.
First question is about the Reid Initiative. Mayor Reid said the Reid Initiative would not take away benefits that have already been earned. What exactly did he mean from that? And is it possible, in fact, as a partial solution, to cap pension benefits that have been earned?
Since I'm working with Mayor Reid on the initiative, I guess I'll take that one. The idea is, in the private sector, maybe someone in here has found out that you come to work on July 1st and the CFO of your company sends out a memo that you get at about 9:30 in the morning that says, you know, we didn't do so well in the last fiscal year, so, you know, we're going to cut your 401k contribution from 6% maximum and a 1-to-1 match. It's going down to 50%, and we're capping it at 2%. Life's, you know, a trouble. Customers haven't been coming. You know, have a nice career. It happens. You know, employers don't like it. But, you know, sometimes in order to save the agency, you have to, you know, to save the company, you have to do things your employees don't like. You can't do that in the public sector. There's case law that says you can't change benefits going forward. As the mayor described, from your first day of work, whatever benefits were offered, they can only go up. So what the Reid Initiative would do would just say, you make it like the private sector standard, that everything you'd earned to the day up to when the benefits change, you'd be able to keep. But well, you're going to earn something different. So you might be earning a 2% at 55 formula when you start, but then one day you're going to earn a 1.5 at 65% formula for the last 10 years of your career. That's a way you are able to manage your liabilities in a way that the private sector has to, but that the public sector, because of some constitutional law, both at the federal and state level, which is probably too mind-numbing to describe, that's just the way it is. And as the mayor said, there's two ways. We can either pursue it through the case law, or we can pursue it at the ballot. And I think both avenues are going to be challenged. So yes, you can do it. There's way, anybody who wants to figure out a way to make it happen can make it happen. The question is whether there's the political will to make it happen, and whether we can convince the voters to make the change on the ballot. So that's the basic answer.
The second question had to do with retiree health benefits, and I think, Carol, this probably is best addressed for you. There's two parts to this. And asking a hypothetical, can't we solve a lot of our problem with unfunded liabilities for retiree health simply by moving employees to Medicare at the age of 65? And then a more practical question regarding specifically Stockton. What did you do in Stockton? What happened in the Stockton Bank tentative settlement at Stockton?
I think that the first thing I have to tell everybody that these are my views. They're not the views of any of my clients or my law firm. First of all, I think it's egregious what happens with retiree health care. And to answer the second question first, in Stockton said because we can break that contract, we're stopping retiree health care. And they did that shortly before the bankruptcy filing, and at the city council meeting, it was heartbreaking to listen to the retirees that showed up that didn't have access to Medicare, didn't have a spouse that was working that had access to insurance. It was a horrible situation. But unfortunately, or I should say it is an unfortunate fact that the legal situation, that the easiest thing to do when your finances are totally screwed up and you're insolvent is to cut off retiree health care. That's a policy that really needs to be revisited. In Stockton, the court formed a retiree committee. The retiree committee was able to negotiate a settlement that resulted in $5 million going into a pot to sort of deal with the hardship cases. It's not clear how that pot's ultimately going to be developed. That agreement is also subject to the confirmation process that starts on Monday. But the long story short is, yes, we should be able to migrate people at 65 to Medicare. We should be able to make better use of, the new, I guess you could call it the Obama medical plan. But at the end of the day, we need to manage those costs, because all we're really doing is moving stuff around on a balance sheet until we can figure out how to handle it. And I think that the answer is not terminating those benefits. The answer is trying to find a solution that doesn't leave those people in jeopardy.
One final question, and this is really a very high-level 60,000-foot question for macroeconomics. I'm not sure who's best left to answer that, but someone has asked. I mean, this is a pension meeting, not the American Economics Association, but we'll ask it anyway. Someone has asked, in your mind, is there a connection between the skyrocketing pension costs we see in our cities, our county, our state, and throughout the nation, and what appear to be inflationary monetary policy by our Federal Reserve Bank? Is our national government trying to inflate away the debt?
Let me just say really quickly, I mean, again, like John said earlier, I think it's above probably all our pay grades to say that, whether it corresponds or not. But what happens at a federal level, yes, does impact that. That happens at a state and local level. And if you can't print money, or you're way out of a debt, then yeah, you've got to restructure that, and you're just rearranging the chairs on the Titanic. We want to make sure, at least from the reasons perspective that, again, a dollar late is a dollar played. You've been promised something, we need to honor the obligation. We're not here to take away pension benefits or make sure that they're sustainable. If you're not sustainable, what's happening at the federal level, yes, can impact, but it's not the whole thing.
So I have a very good friend who is in the financial world, and we play golf and we talk about pensions. And recently he just said, what we really need is we need inflation. And in fact, the premise of the question is a little bit backwards. We are not yet in the place where we have inflation. If we had inflation, you'd be basically diminishing the real value of the promise that was made to employees in the future if your inflation rate exceeds the rate by which your benefit increases. So we have a 2%, like the state of California has the CalPERS has, for state employees, is a 2% inflation factor. So if inflation was running at 4 or 5%, then you would be taking losses in real terms over the long range. So that the answer, one of the ways to solve the pension problem from the taxpayer standpoint is to give them dollars in the future that are worth less than the ones that you have now. But the low interest rates that we have now make it really hard for the pension funds to earn enough money on their fixed income, on their bond portfolios. It's just the same way that many retirees who want to have CDs and things, when your interest rates on your 3 and 5 year CDs are under 1%, it's kind of hard if you're the pension fund who's holding the same types of assets to get towards your 7.5% rate of return if you've got maybe a quarter or a third of your portfolio that's performing in the 2% range with your, it's prudent to have fixed income and portions of your portfolio, but it's really hard to hit your big number when that big chunk of your portfolio is underperforming. How long is that going to last? Well, I don't know.
As an amateur economist, I would have to say that the two are totally unrelated, that they are basically separate, incompetent groups that are screwing up both pictures. Thank you.
You don't have a question? Yes, sir. Would you comment on moving towards a total compensation model for all new public employees and ending once and for all the outmoded defined benefit model being used today?
Well, so I'll start on that real quickly. I mean, early on when we looked at the situation, it really is about who makes, it's a risk tolerance, right, is really what this comes down to, is if things don't happen the way they're supposed to, who's going to bear the risk? And right now with the defined benefit plans, if people live longer, if people retire earlier, or if the market doesn't perform, those are all negative things for defined benefit plans. And there's some way we need to adjust the risk. So is it possible to run a defined benefit plan in a way that's responsible for the taxpayers and for the employees and the employers? Yes, it is possible. Initially I thought we need to get rid of defined benefit plans. But it's not that. The problem is that defined benefit plans require folks to act responsibly, and that's something that the politicians who ultimately appoint the people who go to these boards are not interested in appointing the right people. But if you ask Jack and I and Carol to run a defined benefit plan, it wouldn't look like the ones that are in your county, but you could run one that was responsible. So there's a well-run defined benefit plan's okay, but we don't see any of those, and as a consequence, and the real politic of this is that maybe the defined benefit plan theoretically is okay, but in practice it's no longer useful.
If I might pitch in there a little bit, if we didn't point it out, but of those 21 counties, 20 of them under the County Employment Retirement Law, and one all by itself, San Luis Obispo, one of the ones that sticks out the most is Tulare County. Tulare County is almost fully funded. They haven't created the kind of debt that other places have. And it isn't because the system works. It appears to be because there was a guy running it who, as an individual, said, I'm not going to do what all my peers are doing. And it's well run. If you look at the Dutch pension funds, they adjust. It's defined benefit to an extent, except if their discount rates are more like 4% instead of 7.5%. If they go below, like, I think it's like 104% or something funding, then they automatically have to start paying more. They're starting to consider, we're going to adjust retirement ages based on the financial condition of the fund. Our problem, biggest problem, is governance and lack of accountability. I've analyzed dozens of actions taken by the Mendocino Retirement Board, and with only a few exceptions, what they result in is employees paying less for what they're going to get, retirees getting more than what they paid for, county officials having more money to spend next year, and more debt for the people. And 6 of the 9 members of that board are retirees or employees. There's such an incredible built-in conflict of interest on those organizations.
Yeah,
So,
I
I'm
mean, you
sorry.
could have a defined benefit plan. It's just a different definition. I mean, imagine if you had a system where you would discount everyone's payment every year based upon the unfunded portion of the plan. If you're 70% funded, you only get 70% of your benefit. And you could define that as your benefit. And that would be a very fiscally responsible fund. And in fact, you'd probably find the employees would be tremendously interested in your funding levels if the amount of their compensation depended upon what that level was, right? So, but again, we're in the real politic of the world, and it's probably impossible to put together an actual defined benefit, a responsible defined benefit plan with the right governance.
If the employees had been required to pay part of the cost of paying off the unfunded pensions, 90% of this debt wouldn't exist.
I just want to throw in one quick comment from the private sector. Beginning in around 1980, we began to migrate out of these kinds of pension funds, and it's taken 20 years. And one of the things we see that makes this process very different is we do not have a pension benefit guarantee corporation to pick up those funds that have truly failed. So you're sort of on your own. But the other page you can take out of that 20 years plus experience of moving away from this kind of defined plan is that through the process there were lots of different things that went into place. There were variations, there were modified, it wasn't a straight line to we went from A to B. So one of the things that I work with our clients to think about is what are the options that you might be able to generate for the existing employees that would give them the ability to decide, well, I'd rather have this part of my compensation in retirement, I'd rather have this part in pay today. And generating options is going to be one of the ways to reduce some of the angst that's going to go on as we move through the transition.